Welcome to Bold Voices, Good Yarns. I'm your host, Ian Henzel. Behind every book lies an author's life story. So join me on an interactive journey as we step between the pages to explore how an author's life and their experiences have shaped the stories that we cherish and love. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, and join me as we step between the pages. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Henzel, and I'm the host here at Bold Voices, Good Yarns. So sit back, relax, get comfy, grab a cocktail or a cup of joe, because today we're going to be diving between the pages of yet another fascinating author. This time we're going to be talking to Alfred P. Doblin, who is the author of the brand new collection of short stories, Tales of the Lavender Twilight, and I highly recommend getting a copy of this book. They are fantastic short stories. They're funny, they're poignant. There's a short story in the collection about a gay dog who is looking for a better gay owner. And one of my favorite stories is Mr. Picky Comes to Town. It's about a theater critic who has ruined the lives of many theater people. And lo and behold, his car breaks down in upstate New York. And who lives in that town but people whose lives he ruined? And what happens? He's forced to do community service and direct a amateur production of The Sound of Music. It's hysterical. I highly recommend going out and grabbing a copy. And let's welcome our author. Hello, Alfred.
Hello, Ian. And
Well,
wait, well, look what I just have by chance.
we could have dueling covers. How
Yes,
about
yes, yes.
that?
Many tales. I already have the sequel.
Are you working on a sequel?
Well, I actually do have a finished collection, second one, but with one or two repeat people, but no Mr. Picky at the moment. I have a concept for Mr. Picky for a second story, but it will involve me doing a little travel outside of New York.
Now, Mr. Picky's based on a real Mr. Picky.
Yes, Mr. Picky is based on a very close person in my life who, not a theater critic, but had been given that moniker because he's very particular. But Mr. Particular doesn't quite work, or Mr. Particulate would probably sound like an EPA problem. So it's Mr. Picky. Then that came from him. And he's stylized physically a little bit on this person. It's a little bit of a fantasy, but that it made him a theater critic. And in the end, he probably sounds a little bit like me, but that's, I guess, the problem that most authors have, that everyone sounds a little bit like you. The sad thing is that one of my stories is about a dog. So I guess that's also, I sound a bit like a Cocker Spaniel. But
Well, folks, you have it. If Cocker Spaniels could talk, they would sound just like Alfred. So, Alfred, let's jump into your life. And, normally we get into sharing a bit about your upbringing and how it shaped the world, but I want to let everybody know that Alfred is literary royalty. He is the grand, so to speak, like theater royalty. Is there such a thing as literary royalty? The authors didn't get smaller. It's the books that got smaller,
the
or
fonts,
something from Sunset.
the type
Fonts that got small. Yeah. So Alfred's grandfather is Alfred Doblin, who was a major force in Germany and in the modernist and expressionist literary movement. So, Alfred, you kind of come from literary roots. How did that and your upbringing shape your worldview?
Well, reader to know, who he is. I think, not to get too deep, but I guess we could get too deep. The thing that struck me more than there were probably two things. One, he reached the pinnacle of his fame with Berlin Alexanderplatz, which came out in 1929. And he was, I think, already in his 50s. He was a physician. He was writing. He was well known, but he didn't have fame. And he achieved fame in 1929. There was a film version made. But he was not practicing, but he was a Jew. So he's a Jewish, edgy author in Berlin in 1929. I don't have to tell you where that goes. So and he got out of Europe and it was in the United States during the war and came back to Europe after that. but he never really found his voice never resonated with anybody. You know, I mean, like his fame was really locked into that the end of the Weimar Republic, and well, he continued to write quite a lot, and some of it's been a good amount of it's been translated in the last few years into English. It never resonated, and so it does give you a sense of how temporary uh, recognition can be in terms of an author. You know, that you could be like, you could understand the voice of that moment. I guess if we're being German, zeitgeist of the moment, and then it goes away, you know, and he's not very well known outside of that. The second thing that I guess has always struck me, you know, my father always saw himself as the son of this person rather than himself. And I mean, I've been writing most of my life, and not novels, but as a journalist, and I've always found it a little hard to understand the idea of being in someone's shadow. I mean, I'm aware of who my grandfather was. You know, he died in June of 1957. I was born in November of 1957. So sort of, you know, our paths never crossed at all. So I'm somewhat, I know who he is. I know the body of his work. I've read some of his more significant books in English. I'd like to leave my own mark. You know, I'd like to go into a bookstore and see me. You know, I don't want to just sort of all of a sudden see there's like, you know, Doctorow, you know, when you look at the DOs and, you know, lines and you see, oh, there's Ragtime, you know, and there's a Loon Lake and there's all these Doctorow novels. But we never, you know, there was never anything before that, you know, in terms of, you know, the DOB, you know, but I sort of want to somehow or other fit between the Dickens and the Doctorow. I want there to be like a few Doblins in on the shelf.
Well, how did all that how did your upbringing shape your worldview? I mean, were there any specific, and I mean, and you've written I mean, your life, you were an editor on the Bergen Record, wasn't it?
Right.
The
I've
newspaper.
written, I was the editorial page editor. That was sort of my largest gig for many, many years. And so, I mean, I'm writing opinion pieces and writing editorials. So, I mean, my byline's been out there, and I've, you know, been very fortunate in terms of some recognition as a journalist in that capacity. There was a strong reading foundation in my family. You know, we read from a very, you know, very early age. I grew up on Long Island. We would go into the city a lot, you know, on the train, and you know, I'd have a book. You know, my sister's a few years older. She would have a book, and we were a little bit competitive in the way we were. We probably still are, you know, but you know, we'd be focusing on, you know, reading our book and who could finish their book in a day. You know, no one was picking up Dostoevsky at that point. So reading was very important, and owning books was very important. Very, very important to my parents. That you, I mean, libraries were significant. We went to libraries, but they really believed in ownership of books. That it gave you a sense of the value of what it was and of words. And I was very much encouraged to read. You know, and I did. You know, from the silly stuff that I think young boys read back in the seas. You know, you read Hardy Boys, and I read Tom Swift, you know, and I guess somewhere along the way I moved to Jonathan Swift. Reading was a big deal, but I kind of gravitated kind of quickly from the lighter fare, you know, into books that were beyond my comprehension. You know, like lugging around a big kind of Shakespeare thing, trying to work my way through Shakespeare. And I read Anna Karenina um, when I was in on a trip with my father into Europe. I was 16, and I'd never met my uncles, his brothers, and they'd all moved to France over a period of time after the war. And my father went to bed very early, you know, and I didn't go to bed very early, but he didn't want me to roam around Paris as a 16-year-old. So I went to Shakespeare and Company, the legendary, you know, bookstore, and I picked up
Yeah.
a copy. I'm not making this up. You know, I was a very precocious 16-year-old. I was my dog, Maurice, in The Dog Pimp of Columbia Heights. And I picked up a copy of Anna Karenina, and I read it in the week that I was there, because he would go to bed like 8:30, 9 o'clock, and what was there for me to do, you know, like in this room? So I just, you know, was just caught up in that particular novel in real time. I mean, I read it really quickly. I mean, I didn't have a desire to like go to the whatever it is, the Gare Saint Lazare, like to go to train stations and like look at possibly drugged out women who were semi-suicidal. But you know, it was a very lush, romantic kind of novel in its own way. But
I kind of picture you sitting at a cafe in a beret drinking absinthe
Yeah.
and a
And
sidewalk
I was
cafe
sipping
reading
water.
Anna Karenina.
This is water. No, if I was reading Hemingway. If I was reading Hemingway, I would have the absinthe, with the little. They have the spoon with
Sugar
the yeah.
cube, yeah. So let me ask you, what was a pivotal moment, or what was that moment when you thought, well, I'm reading, I want to write? When did that happen? And how did it happen?
I don't really know when it happened. It's funny. When I was in high school, I had two fabulous teachers, two fabulous English teachers, who I stayed friends with till they died. One died not of COVID, but during COVID in her middle 90s. The other one made it into his 80s, I think. And we stayed good friends for decades and decades, and they encouraged me to read a lot and to write a lot. And I entered a contest. It was a library contest, essay thing to write about Lindenhurst, where I grew up, Lindenhurst, Long Island. Its big claim to fame is Pat Benatar went to the same high school I did, 4 years ahead of me. And I entered this contest, and it had to do with something like write about Lindenhurst, which is I don't know, it'd be like writing about Liverwurst. It was not a poetic kind of town, but I wrote about it, and it was a little satirical and it was a little edgy, and I had never quite written that way, and I won, and the grand prize I still have it. The grand prize was the Broadway cast album to Pippin.
Gosh,
This
yes.
is the 70s. This was like, I don't know,
So this would have been about
73, 70, well, probably 74. I don't think I was a senior in high school, so maybe 74. And that kind of resonated with me, but I was also on a music track, and my degree is actually in music. I ended up getting a BFA in music, so I was a voice major. But I could have sort of gone either way, and opportunities to fall into journalism just sort of fell my way, and I jumped in. Uh, so I've always written. I mean, when I was younger, I have a bunch of novels that never found a house. One of them found an agent when I was in my early 20s. I thought, oh, this is it. I just had this vision of like, they'll make a movie. I'll be in Los Angeles hanging out with the cast of Dynasty or Falcon. Actually, Falcon Crest had the hotter men, in my opinion.
God, Alfred, we're gonna date ourselves here.
Well, I've been doing that all week. I was chatting with a colleague who took a tumble in the subway system, and I was suggesting that she go see, a physician, somebody I was attached to where we are, and said, he's a real Marcus Welby, and she said, like, who? And I said, oh, that's right, you're too young. And then I had to try to explain, it was Robert Young, and that didn't go anywhere. I said, Father knows best, and she had, a slight idea. So yes, I am dating myself in terms of where I'm coming from age-wise. But I guess I thought in my 20s it was all going to happen, that I was going to click, and it didn't. And then I really just started pursuing more of my writing career. I think the other thing that's interesting in my journey, I wasn't out in high school, and I wasn't out in my 20s, and I was even as a musician. It's kind of odd that I didn't come out in my 20s, but I didn't resonate. Nothing about the community at that time resonated to me as someone who grew up Catholic. Somewhat, I'm more of a suit and tie kind of guy. The gay thing was hard for me to grasp because there were no gay people that I could relate to at that moment in time. The Studio 54 scene was happening for straight people, and I guess some gay people, and there were bathhouse things, and it wasn't where I was at. And I remember chatting with my first boyfriend. I was in my early 30s. And one of my things that conflicted me at the time, and I find it fascinating that the first collection that's finally printed is as gay as it could get. It's all about gay people. I felt like that if at the point that I was fully comfortable as a gay person, I wouldn't be able to help not write about being gay and what that was. And as a journalist, I would write about, LGBT issues because we weren't really using LGBTQ IA plus.
Right.
And so, I mean, people knew I was gay, and if anyone wanted to know I was gay, I would say I was gay, but I didn't go around, with a flag and go.
What do you think? What do you think held you back from coming out? And I say that because I came out. I was 17 when I came out. So, what do you think held you back?
I think growing up Catholic doesn't help. And I don't mean that as a negative because I mean, I'm not hostile to the Catholic experience. And I worked in the Catholic media for a period of time. I came out at the time I was working in the Catholic media, not on the job, but I mean, that was really when I, started processing that I needed to be authentic to me. I was a bit of a late bloomer, so I wasn't so much focused on relationships. So I think those things, I was kind of tightly wound kind of guy. I still probably am a little tightly wound. I think those things impacted. And then, very quickly, in the 80s, when I was in my 20s, there was the plague. And that was very, off-putting, and trying to understand.
For our younger viewers, I
Yeah.
just want to
You're
say
talking the
that it's
around
referring to
1980. Yeah.
AIDS. Yeah, that.
And trying to come to grips with how that fit. And it was a challenging time to come out. I mean, when I was finally starting dating, it was early, I guess, very early in the 90s, and people were still, there was no cocktail that was effective. But at that point, I needed to be who I was, and I needed to be sort of out there. I mean, literally and figuratively. So I don't know. I mean, I look back and I wonder, had I come out like at the end of college or right after college, I don't know if I'd be around to write about stories of gay men in their 60s.
It's interesting because I interviewed another author who was in the military, and he said something very similar, that having to be so circumspect in the military and not do anything, he felt that in a way was why he was here, because had he had the kind of abandon earlier, he might have not survived the AIDS epidemic. So I've been hearing that from more than one author, shall we say, gentlemen of a certain age.
I'm more pleased you said gentleman. The certain age doesn't bother me so much. Because I look back, I was in this singing group right out of college. It's called the Wing Victory Singers. It had been formed in the Korean War, which was before my time, but it continued to exist. And the guy that ran it he's long perished, so there's no defamation. I spent enough time as a journalism that there's no defamation, but the guy clearly, was an unresolved gay man. And there was a lot of churn, meaning turnover, in this group. It was 6 men. There would be like maybe 4 that were gay and 2 that were straight. So I guess when I was in the group, there were like 4 that were gay and 1 who wasn't knowing what there was and 1 who would be straight. And we worked the Catskills, so that actually the fact that Mr. Picky Comes to Town is set in the Catskills,
Uh-huh.
is because I spent a summer
Yeah.
singing with a group in all of those places that are now gone. And they would talk about the gay young men who they were like, everybody was like about 22 to 25. They were talking about bathhouse scenes, when, like when we had days off or whatever, and the life they were describing, their choices. And I didn't have enough of perspective to realize, there is no one kind of way to be gay. And I think the difficult thing that men of our age had when we were young men, and certainly when we were boys, is that wasn't ever presented. The concept of what was gay, there were the horrible tropes that we grew up with, the way people describe, light and the loafer and all those little words that I wouldn't use because I wouldn't give the words breath, that described us. And then there were people who were jubilant about the newfound freedoms in the 70s, and they were just exploring everything in the 70s and the early 80s, and good for them. I mean it's horrible that they paid a horrible price for that, but that was part of who they were at that moment, and that was part of who they are as people, that they were just naturally wanting to experience everything out there. I think for me, that just didn't appeal to me. I mean, they described some of the scenes they were doing. They were describing some of the ancillary, diseases they were picking up long before anyone knew about AIDS. It was like, oh my God, this is disgusting. Even thinking about like how that happened. And that was probably a little immature on my part, at that point, because I was immature.
Well, it's probably you just hadn't been exposed. So the way I can relate to it is, I mean, you were reading Anna Karenina at 16. I had picked up a copy, the book form of the script of Boys in the Band at 16. And I remember reading it, and that so frightened me. It was probably about well, I was almost 18 when I came out, but it's probably a year and a half I just didn't want to be like any of those people. So I can relate to that until until we learn that we can really be who we are, and we can find people who better resonate with our own sense of self and who we are.
Well, and I think, if I were to look at one of the things that motivated Tales of the Lavender Twilight, and even this other thing that I've yet to send to you or to anyone that's completed. There are books I enjoyed, like the Tales of the City. All those books, they were fun to read. And they're easy reads, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. They're meant to be enjoyable. They're not Anna Karenina. It's not even like reading like. The Forsyte Saga or something, where there's a little more nuance in the whatever. But everybody in those books, they're a little bit older than me, not a lot older, but they're all doing drugs, and they're all playing around, and they're all doing party things that are just not me, and they're not the way most of my friends were. And I wanted to create stories and a universe that was populated by people that were more similar to the people I run into in the bars that I do go to, where I'm kind of not a norm, because that's a bad choice for, George passed away the week we were taping this thing, but places where you have that kind of fellowship, of friends, and that I guess I just don't have friends that related to that. So I wanted to create, a universe where many of the people are not extraordinary, in that they're walking around and they're hugely demonstrative or buoyant, or they've got a lot of flair. I mean, Mr. Picky has a certain amount of flair, but I'm dressed in Prada flair. He's a better tailored version of me. Probably the person or the character with the most flair in all of the stories is Maurice, who's a Cocker Spaniel. Because he's a little he probably you know, would be the kind of person that would wear like a dickie, if he was a person, walking out in the street,
Well, Maurice has very specific ideas about the type of gay man he wants to have as his owner.
yes,
He's very opinionated.
and look, I was an opinion writer, so I mean, I'm very opinionated, but and it's funny because Maurice's type isn't necessarily my type. Mr. Picky is actually more my type. I mean, Mr. Picky.
And again, folks, Maurice is a Cocker Spaniel.
But and Maurice worked, because I knew someone once I was friends with whose name was Maurice, who always wanted a Cocker Spaniel. So there are certain origin stories to a lot of the people. I had a friend who's read the book and was saying, like, I want to meet John, and it took me a minute to actually even think of, like, who's John, because there's a whole bunch of stories, and I wrote some of these a while ago. And John is this bartender at a West Village bar. He owns the bar, and he's, a very kind of big, sturdy, kind of athletic guy, kind of bearish, but somewhere between, I guess, a bear and an otter. A bear and an otter, but with the age of a daddy. I have no idea what that exactly makes, but it's hot. Whatever it is, it's hot. And he's kind of a composite of people probably I have fantasized over the years, about. But it was funny that this, somebody came to say, I really want to meet this, and it wasn't the character I would think, like nobody said, oh, I want to meet Mr. Picky, or I want to be a Cocker Spaniel.
Well, you've given me a great segue into a question I ask all of our authors, and it's interesting that one of your readers said they want to meet a character in the book, because what I ask all of our authors is, if you could live in a book, when authors create books, they create worlds, they populate it with people. If you could live in a book, what book would you choose to live in, and why?
See, that's an easy thing, because in the sequel, I should hold this up, in the sequel to, in the sequel, I wrote a story, and it's about Howard's End by Forrester. And I actually have a good writer friend who did one of the blurbs for the book, who just jokes, he's just obsessed with E.M. Forrester. And I said, well, at least he's gay, even though he came out way too late. And the character in this story, and it is kind of personal, because Howard's End, I think, is just such an extraordinary book. But the universe of England at that period of time, I find fascinating. That sort of Edwardian thing is really great, because you have all the style and the manners, but you have toilets inside, you have electricity, you have the beginning of, motor vehicles, you have a lot of stuff. Maybe the dentistry isn't so great. The British didn't care about their teeth, but there's
Apologies to our British viewers.
Well, back then they didn't care about their teeth. So let me qualify that. Early 20th century Britons, if you see the Austin Powers things, they apparently didn't care about their teeth. That's a recurring joke, which doesn't line up with that I read Anna Karenina at 16 that I'm now quoting Mike Myers. But Howard's End, there's so much about just the layer of the book, but the universe that they're in, and actually specifically about that house, because the house is so integral to the story and the way that it is described, and you have this sense of the lushness of the lawns around it, because they describe the first Mrs. Wilcox, the train of her dress sort of trailing through, and in the story that is yet to be published, this character goes into the novel and he has a torrid affair with Paul Wilcox, who is the younger son, who's only mentioned very briefly, and he's sent off to like Nigeria or something. And I come up with, well, he didn't go to Nigeria. He actually ended up in the Savoy with this other person, and they have a lovely time. So Howard's End would be, would be the universe I'd like to be in.
I could see that. I often say, and I've studied quite a bit about the Edwardian period, because my feeling is, should a rip in the fabric of time ever open up and I find myself in Edwardian England, I'm fully prepared on how to behave and dress. While we're in Forrester, I can't help but saying, if I were to choose, I'd be pushing Morris or Maurice out of the way, because I think it's Scudder who I would be going after.
Well, actually, you see, now I'm going to have to send you this story, because it begins with these two friends in modern time arguing, and one of them is saying, he thinks, Clive is hot, and I'm saying, but the characters arguing back, but Clive never comes out, like at least Morris comes out, and, Alex Scudder, is the hottie, and there's a scene in this short story where all these characters who you think are gay or should be gay are all having luncheon at Simpson's on the Strand at the same time that in the novel, the older Mr. Wilcox is having luncheon with his daughter Evie and with the Schlegel he eventually marries. And it's kind of fun because there's the younger brother in A Room with a View, Freddie. I think it's Freddie. I'm having a moment. Freddie is just so obviously gay. Forrester didn't realize it, but I mean, Freddie is just obviously gay. And, if you sort of start looking at these Forrester novels in this period, they're just characters that just have to be gay. And if they're not, you make them gay.
Well, folks, I want you to know that I don't think in any other show are you going to get a discussion of what are the hot characters in Forrester novels and who we want to get it on with. So I think this might be a podcast first. And I'm going to ask the viewers, what characters would you want to get it on with? Leave it in the comments below. Alfred, I want to thank you for being on our show, and I hope we can have you on again. Once again, we've been in conversation and diving between the pages with Alfred P. Doblin, the author of Tales of the Lavender Twilight. It's out and it's available now. I hope we can have you on the show again. Very interested in hearing about what comes next after Lavender Twilight. So for everybody out there, please, you'll be seeing up at the top of the screen, please subscribe and follow us. It helps us a lot. It helps the show to show up for other viewers. So please follow us. Thank you for being with us. And thank you, Alfred, for being on the show.
You're welcome. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
We'll see you all online again real soon when we jump between the pages with another fascinating author. Once again, my name is Ian Henzel, and I've been the host here on Bold Voices, Good Yarns. See you online again soon. You've been listening to Bold Voices, Good Yarns, brought to you by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on social media. Search for Rattling Good Yarns Press. Also, visit our website at rattlinggoodyarns.com, where you can find great reads and interesting articles about the world of books. See you soon!